Want to design good user experiences for AR? Then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, a VR and AR developer, evangelist, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Kharis O'Connell, former head of product at Archiact and the current head of UX and industrial design at Meta. Kharis is also the author of the book Designing for Mixed Reality, currently available for free at O'Reilly Media. But before we begin our conversation, I would like to thank my good friends at Veer VR for sponsoring this episode. Thanks to their support, I'm able to continue to create great content to share with you. Veer VR allows you to easily share your 360-degree photos and videos with the entire world. Plus, they now have a VR experience that lets you build 360-degree tours easily. You can access Veer through the web, mobile, and all major VR platforms. You can check them out at howtocreatevr.com/Veer VR. Make sure you use this URL so they know I sent you there. All right, our bills are paid, Kharis, so welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
You are, as we mentioned, head of UX for Meta, and we're going to be talking about Meta and what it is in just a second. But before we get into that, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, expand on my intro there?
My background is pretty diverse. I've lived in a lot of places all around the world. As you can probably tell from my accent, I come from the United Kingdom and was interested in design as a young boy. Technical drawing, I think it was called back then, before CAD and the sort of modernization of the industry. And I moved around Europe, living in Switzerland and Berlin. And I think really in Berlin, I really moved sort of heavily into the area of design. And I first worked on smartphones, designing smartphones. I was picked up by Nokia to work on some early AR back in 2009. And I moved to Vancouver, Canada, to head up the design group there for Nokia. I finally ended up here in the Bay Area working in AR. So it's been quite a diverse set of, I guess, jobs and approaches towards design.
So we're going to get into the specifics of design, but something that came to mind is how different is designing for AR versus mobile? Was there anything in any skills you had in the mobile side that kind of hurt you when switching to AR or helped you?
That's a good question. It's probably a question I get the most from speaking with designers, especially young designers. So to answer that directly, it's very difficult to move from mobile into AR. And I think on a couple of fronts. One is the tool sets of how you go about designing are different. And secondly, all of the rules around 2D design and what you learn around best practices are mostly inapplicable to designing in AR. So it's really a massive change for design.
Well, and I would imagine in mobile, you have standards set, right? Mobile's been around for quite a while now, whereas with AR, whether standards are there or maybe they're not implemented yet or people are working on them or they're fluctuating constantly. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a good observation. That would be mine as well. I think my experience has been that most of the frameworks on how you go about doing things, whether it be on the web or in mobile, are very well understood at this stage. We've had this kind of standardization, let's say, of design in those mediums. And I think in AR and VR as well, that's been heavily influenced by people coming from gaming. And that's kind of a logical path because the skill sets, the hard skill set of the people coming from gaming matches, the way that things are done in AR and VR, regardless of whether or not you're making an entertainment-based application or not. A lot of people are coming from kind of a gamification approach. And I think the one things that can carry over well is a lot of the kind of design rigor that you learn through traditional design practices. So, ideation and prototyping and user testing and those things. So there are some things that carry over, but I think you really do, pardon the kind of pun, but you literally have to think outside the box with AR and VR.
Right. I 100% agree with you. I mean, the language of the UI isn't solidified in VR. I mean, perfect example is teleportation, right? There is a billion different ways of teleporting, let's say in a game or in a training, a VR experience specifically, where there's no standard. So you can't just, anybody can pick up a phone today and knows how to zoom in, pinch, rotate, whatever, because it's already set. But you can't do the same thing in VR, and not just desktop VR, but then you have, or AR, right? Then you have your mobile device version, or you have your desktop version, and there's hopefully that language will be solidified soon.
Yeah, I mean, I liken it to the early days of the web. I'm old enough to remember the early days of the web, and the GeoCities era of websites, and you can do a Google search and look back at these kind of web pages, and they followed no structure. It was just elements scattered all over the page. People were putting, GIFs everywhere, and things were flickering, and there was no kind of structure.
The blink tag, man. I still remember that blink tag.
Yeah, exactly. The blink tag. So it took a while for the web to kind of standardize around frameworks, and that was because it moved away from the spectacle of being able to access information, which was the early kind of hedonism of the web, through to, okay, what's the point of the web? Well, it's to order information in a way that allows people to traverse these websites without having to relearn everything all the time. And that was a big driver to, the adoption of the web as an information source, not just the kind of gimmicks and blink tags and flickering flames and all that kind of stuff. Similar things happened in mobile as well. It had to standardize, and you could look at iOS and Android right now as very, two sides of the same coin. But of course, the early days of mobile, like when I was with Nokia, it was a dark time. So it was also very, very difficult to make standards.
Part of the standards came from the bigger companies, right? Specifically speaking for mobile, like iOS, iPhone, and then later on Android, Google, right? Do you feel that the same thing needs to happen from a UX perspective on both, not just AR, but VR as well? Let's call it MR, just to keep it generic.
Yes, I do. I think that's also something, speaking for Meta, that we believe, as a whole, is that right now, developers and designers, they kind of do everything somewhat in a bubble. Like, they come up with ideas and they sort of throw things together. And there's a lot of risk involved in that. There's a lot of risk for them, because they may not know the wider picture of best practices and things that have already been tried and failed. So they're going to go straight ahead and they're going to go and do what they want. What this creates right now is discombobulated experiences where, again, just like I mentioned with the web, users cannot go from one thing to another coherently. What they have to do is they have to rethink, okay, how does this one work? What does this inference mean? What does this iconography mean? And that's fine in the gaming world because it's based around, entertainment. It's fun. You don't mind investing the effort in learning a game because you're going to be playing it for a long time. But when you start looking at spatial computing, you have to see it through the lens of how people compute right now. And so, we have standards, whether it be on the desktop, you have a menu bar, file, edit, all of these drop-down menus, how the system works, even if the applications within it are different and have different functions. And that allows you to move very, very fast and efficiently. I think what we think is a similar thing has to happen in especially in AR for it to gain any sort of mass adoption, because right now it's just a lot of small discombobulated experiences.
Right. So do you feel that new UX designers that have never done anything, let's say for the web or mobile, have an advantage over people that have been doing UX design forever, but on the more traditional, quote unquote, flat media?
I don't think it's a black and white answer. I mean, my own experience at Meta, we've hired people who come from traditional design backgrounds. We've also hired people who have absolutely no traditional design and have come from gaming companies. I don't think any singular approach is going to get it right. what it requires is an understanding from both sides. And so you need this kind of synergy of understanding because, you got to remember that 2D designers have always worked like figuratively inside of a box, inside of a rectangle. And everything that you design, you control. You can absolutely control the user experience. You have to click a button to move to the next stage or to open a new page or to whatever it is. And it's entirely confined. Conversely, with gamers, they're used to creating sort of breadcrumb type experiences where you move and traverse through open spaces, whether that be in VR or on AR. And I think that on the one hand, you need the kind of understanding of flow from 2D, but you need the 3D people to try to translate that meaningfully into that medium, because you can't just, successfully take 2D paradigms and just kind of paste it into AR or into VR, because then you end up with something akin to what we call a smartphone on your face syndrome. It's just a bunch of rectangles floating in your screen. You don't really know why. You have to tap buttons still. There's still menu systems, flat menu systems. And I don't believe that is profound enough of an experience to shift people away from what they already know. So it's too close, you could argue, to what we use already, what we use right now. And so I think what's interesting is things that are outside of that kind of constraint.
Right. And I think this is an issue that's happening also in filmmaking, where you have, in traditional filmmaking, you have the line, right? The viewer is on one side and the action is happening on the other side. But in 360 video, in cinematic VR, you are the content. And I think part of the UI, when thinking about UI in a VR or AR experience, it's no longer that you are outside of the monitor and you're clicking buttons and there's an interface. Is how are you part of that interface? Because you as the participant, no longer the viewer, but the participant, are actually part of the content. What's your take on that?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we think about at Meta. We have a saying, we say, you are the OS, you are the operating system in AR. And so whereas, like you say, you click on things and you know where things are, in many ways in AR, you are the center of the universe, and you need to orientate yourself around how things work, rather than, right now you plonk a rectangle or a laptop in front of you on the table, nothing is going to happen anywhere else in the room. Everything happens within that screen. You have full control within that parameter. In AR, with the movement and the freedom there, essentially you have to become more of the kind of, let's say, controlling mechanism for where things appear and where things don't appear. And you kind of have to use your own memory and some aspects of your own knowledge to understand how to utilize these systems meaningfully. And I think that's, now we're kind of getting to the crux of the challenge, because with freedom comes a big responsibility. And designing for that freedom is hard, because the purpose of UX, the definition of UX, is to craft a user experience. And now we're in a situation where I don't know how you're going to encounter what I've made for you. I have no control over that. So that's something that flips everything on the head.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think making things also from a UI perspective more intuitive, kind of like a door. You don't need instructions to open the door handle, right? And duplicating that in an AR experience, I think is really important. So when you are in that experience, you don't need a tutorial to run it. It should be like real life, basically.
Yeah, we try to focus a lot on making natural interfaces. And really what we mean by that is try to make things as easy to understand, easy to comprehend as possible. So we take a very literal approach to user interface design. Where it makes sense, we will, like you just said, we will give you the form that you already understand, so that you don't need to comprehend the language of the system. It's already something that you see and that you can touch and that you can use. So I think we have a certain angle. I mean, a lot of other companies take a very different approach. They're still very much focused on, panels and clickers and buttons. And I think on one hand, there are merits to that to a degree. It allows people coming from a smartphone, to say, hey, I've seen this screen before. I understand the scrolling list. But our point of view is, does a flat scrolling list make sense in a three-dimensional spatial environment anymore? These are the kind of questions that we're looking to answer.
Right, definitely. And of course, the answer to that may be it depends, right? Depends on the experience, on the context, on the device.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you kept mentioning Meta. Why don't we talk a little bit about Meta? Exactly what is it that you guys do?
Our mission is to make a natural interface for the future of computing. What we're actually trying to answer is a bigger, more profound question, which is, what does the future of spatial computing look like? Our headset is designed to help us try to manifest what that could be like. But fundamentally, at our core, there's a lot of philosophical approach that we're going for. I mean, we don't want to be the smartphone on your face. We don't believe that that's the answer. We're trying to make things that are intuitive and natural. And I think a big part of what we do is focused on direct interaction. And really what I mean by that is, actually utilizing your own limbic system, your hands, your arms, your position to manipulate content. We're trying to find natural ways that you can get your hands into the content itself and the system, rather than, again, with pointer systems, there's still a distance. It's the equivalent of the mouse, and we see it like that. We're trying to find ways around this. So Meta really is on a mission to transform the way you do things, I think.
So you guys aren't really focused on creating and selling AR glasses. You're really focused on creating that metaphor for spatial UX design. So are you guys currently, not right now, but maybe in the future, trying to become sort of the standard or come up with other companies to create a standard?
I think we're definitely trying to create a standard. We do an inordinate amount of research around this. We have, within Meta, we have neuroscientists. We have a lot of research going on, research and development. We have, big design group. We have a lot of those questions around what exactly, are we doing in terms of what have we learned? Like, really, what have we learned through this? And I think the headset is a vessel or, arguably a dongle into our approach. I think one of the things that we've, at our very core, see as very important is to be able to see as much as possible, to feel truly immersed. And so that's why, I think as of right now, even still with all of the new entrants into AR, we still have the largest field of view. And that actually means a lot for us, because what it means is that you can spread things out in your environment, and it really does feel far more natural than the kind of, telescopic or binocular approach that are often with other types of headsets. So that's a big core part of our promise, is that, when you enter our world, you're fully immersed in a true sense. Like, it's all around you, and you can use your hands and you can grab things to the side of you, and you don't need to worry about whether or not it's out of your field of view so much. We really emphasize those aspects.
Do you feel that FOV is currently limited because of the technology in all AR glasses out there? Do you feel that ultimately there will be a standardized field of view that encompasses the entire view itself for people?
Good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of research being done on optical approaches. We do a tremendous amount of research on optics, and we don't believe right now that the current optical approaches from competitors provide the field of view that we think is needed to transform how you work, to see all your content, And I think to answer your point, yes, eventually we'll end up with a kind of standardization. You could say, much like the way VR has got there, everyone's above kind of 100 degrees. Anything below that is, it's simply not enough. I think that's going to occur. I think we've been lucky. We've had a head start just due to our, pretty unique optical engine approach that we have with the Meta 2. The issue with the smaller field of view is really more, you don't get things in your peripheral vision. And of course, in the real world, you do get things in your peripheral vision. It's a large part of your visual system. It's an important part of your visual system. And of course, that's entirely missing with other headsets. So your head direction has to be very accurate to pick up what's going on. Whereas it's looser with the way that we have our field of view, because naturally you can pick up more things. So this allows for different types of experiences to happen. I guess one way to look at it is you could say we are emphasizing kind of a widescreen 16 by 9 cinematic AR, and most, nearly everyone else is doing a kind of old school 4:3 ratio screen. And, we feel that it's important to get as much of that kind of experience in your view as possible.
Yeah, and I think ultimately everybody's going to go into, like you said, the 16 by 9, because that just makes sense, right? I mean, that's one of my turnoffs in AR is the small FOV that it provides. It just takes away from that immersive experience, because you can see, that line right next to your eye, and all of a sudden you know that this is not really in front of you. It's fake. Whereas in VR, your brain, after a while, once you're in it and you have 120 degrees FOV, then you're in it, and your brain says, we're here, we're away from the room. I think that part is missing. So I think ultimately that may turn out to be sort of the standard, like you said, above 100 degrees. From a design perspective, what skills should designers have when designing for the Meta or, the Magic Leap, which is out, just AR in general? And I'm talking about glasses, not because we'll talk a little bit about mobile devices, which I feel AR experiences, as VR do, or some VR experiences do, they should be responsive to the device they're in. But sticking with AR glasses, what are some skills that designers should have today and not even consider getting into it unless they have that skill?
So I think the biggest thing that you need to understand as a designer when you're entering into this medium is the concept of the Z-plane of depth, because that is the biggest, most profound change for design. Is if you're coming from, the web or mobile, there is a singular depth to the experience, and that allows you to lay things out in a way that's like putting jigsaw pieces together on a table. But, if you were to put a 3-dimensional jigsaw together and you were trying to understand how do the pieces fit behind these other pieces, and when should they appear, and when should they not appear, and when should they react to things? It's akin to designing for an arena rather than a rectangle. And I think that is something that it's the first thing, from experience, it's the first thing that designers who come from 2D get impacted by. Because what that means is that even when you're trying to actually prototype or even sketch on a whiteboard what you think it's like, even the medium you use for sketching it doesn't allow you to show the depth. So it's very hard to speak the language needed for people to understand the position of things in the world. And the other thing I think on a more tangible level is that you move away from pixels per inch to pixels per degree. And again, that is because it's a Z-plane approach to design. It's not just about the resolution of your screen. It is about the fact that an element that could fill your screen, if you've got a certain size of display or resolution, of course, when it's further away, it dramatically drops in that resolution. So that means that you may design something and it looks awesome when you're stood next to it. But as soon as it's, far away in the glasses, you suddenly can't read it anymore. And not because of how far away it is, but because the display itself, the display technology has rendered it down, and now it's simply, the pixel level is too low. So these are real impacts that we see as well, talking with designers, and it's very difficult, like I said, to design for that. So to get your head around that takes a while. It takes a while for designers to do that.
Two things came to my mind based on your comments that you just said. The first one about the Z-plane. That happens also with participants. I put a lot of people through VR, specifically VR as opposed to AR. And I always have to tell them, hey, you can move forward, move backwards, you can duck. And especially like if you put them like on tilt brush, they start painting and they paint just like they're painting in Photoshop. And I'm like, no, you can paint all around you. And it's a hard concept even for me when I got started to comprehend that we're not just X, Y, but we've got Z now. And as a participant, I think maybe it's because of, 40 years of computing that has been flat, and now we have to change into the spatial computing metaphor. We have to readjust ourselves, and maybe this will be a natural thing for the new generation, right? People growing up now and starting to use VR and AR and growing up with that, the Z plane will be just, yeah, of course, it makes sense. But to the rest of us, because we grew up with just X and Y, it's a little bit hard to get used to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I bring Meta headset back to my family. I've got 2 small kids, and I can put them in the headset, and they have absolutely no problem understanding things, because to exactly what you just mentioned around tilt brush, I can put them in a headset and they will always try to walk around everything. They will never assume that they're looking at a screen. There is no screen for them. And so I do think that it's obviously, from a generational perspective, it's going to take, for our generation and stuff, yes, you need to make that kind of cognitive leap of understanding. But I think for kids in the future, this is going to be, they're not going to understand how we ever used 2-dimensional devices to show things. It would be the equivalent of going to a gallery and looking at old oil paintings. It's like, why? Oh my God, that's how you used to do things. And I think that this will profoundly change the way people communicate with each other.
So we spoke about spatial design in AR for glasses, right? Because that's where you have 6 degrees of freedom. But what about when you're with a mobile phone? What are some considerations there? Because I think that's where AR is going to take off, at least at the beginning, right? There's millions and millions of people with phones, and that just seems like the perfect device to at least introduce people to AR. So if you're a designer and starting to design AR for mobile phones, what are some considerations there?
So I'll give a little bit of my own history. So back in 2008, I was working on AR at Nokia. And at that time, this was the first wave of AR, and we were working on an application called City Lens, which allowed you to hold your phone up and you could see landmarks by looking through the screen. It would overlay landmarks on your environment for navigation and points of interest and all that stuff. There was also a wave of other AR applications at that time, like Layar and Wikitude, and it was the hot thing. I mean, this is for a lot of newcomers to AR, people forget that 10 years ago, it happened before on mobile. I think the learnings around mobile AR is that it's an incredible, gateway drug to spatialization, to the concept that you don't need to look at menus and buttons and all of the things that we were used to. But for designing for mobile AR, there are a few things that will be very difficult to, let's say, shift over from that medium to a headset medium, or even, to our own headset. And that's around interaction, because the thing is with, whether it's AR Kit, AR Core, any of these things, they require you to still tap on this small rectangle, and you're tapping like it's a button, and you're placing an object in space by tapping on it. And it gives you an approximation of what AR is like, but it's very difficult to take that learning and then think of Meta's headset with the hand interaction and say, okay, is that good enough to translate across to a more immersive medium? So I think it is incredibly useful, mobile AR, and it definitely, like I just said, gets people into understanding what AR is. But the constraints around it are you still have to tap the screen. And a bigger one is that it is not the best medium to experience AR in. So while I think there's a lot of interest right now, just as there was 10 years ago, and Pokemon and all of these things, really kind of raised this interest, it proves that people like to move around. It proves that people like this kind of searching kind of mode. It's almost a natural human trait to want to pathfind or search your environment to find things. And I think that a lot of that has been interesting, but I do want to say that the big challenge in mobile AR right now is that predominantly it's gaming. It's very small, tiny little games, apart from obviously Pokemon. A lot of the others are gimmicks right now. So, or face filters and these kinds of things. They're getting people used to the idea of virtualization. But I think people are still going to have a tremendous shock when they eventually do adopt AR glasses. And I think for the designers of those applications on the mobile, I think from a technological perspective, it's a relatively easy move over. You know, they're building in Unity. For mobile, it's going to be Unity on the headsets, and I think that that's going to be a relatively, well-oiled path to this. The challenge will just be around the interaction because it's so radically different. But I do want to say that we recognize and appreciate the fact of what mobile AR has done. It's essentially a low or no cost entry drug in some way into understanding spatialization.
Well, and it brings up an interesting issue because everybody has a phone, so it's an easy way to push. Like, we want everybody to get into AR, right? Because that would help the industry. But then again, if everybody's using the mobile device, are we teaching them the incorrect metaphor that they're going to expect to use the same thing when eventually we'll go into glasses or whatever it's going to be, whether it's going to be implanted in your eyes directly, I don't know. But are we, for the sake of expanding the market and putting things into mobile devices, the phone, are we creating a new generation that will expect that kind of metaphor on the future devices? And of course, that metaphor, that UI metaphor, is not going to work properly, right? Like you said, it's going to be more spatial and it won't be all this tapping.
Yeah, that's true. It won't be like that. And I think that's okay for now. I mean, you couldn't, on the other side of the coin, it's not like mobile AR can support headset style interactions anyway. So they're kind of forced into doing things the way they are right now. But I think there's pardon the pun, there is a large leap to get into the glasses. And I think it's a good one because obviously, these people are used to hunt and peck by looking through, a 5-inch, essentially a tiny little 5-inch window that they're holding out in front of them and peering through to understand the world. And then suddenly with AR glasses, it's everywhere. They're in it, right? And I think that is the big difference here. So it isn't necessarily teaching them the interaction metaphors that are useful, but it is giving them a hint of what it will be like. Let's say if you're placing a virtual object, like IKEA does, where they have, place furniture in your house. People find it useful right now because it gives them a hint of what it might look like. Imagine in the future where you can put on AR glasses and you open IKEA's application and now you can outfit your entire house with a new look and decide whether you want to buy it. That is the kind of difference here with what AR glasses will allow people to experience.
Right, definitely. So what about foveated rendering and selective focus? I mean, that's something that's really big in VR, or they're trying to make big in VR, right? Is this something that will affect AR as well? And how does that affect design decisions? So
I think foveated rendering is going to be incredibly important in AR as well, because it suffers from the same challenges as VR, namely, GPU performance, CPU performance, and as you move increasingly into photorealism, going, in the future, it's incredibly taxing. I mean, right now, with the Meta 2, for example, this is plugged into a high-end PC in order to give it the kind of graphical power needed to drive a high-resolution display like we have. But I think that things like foveated rendering allow you to, make smart use of your GPU. So I think that's going to change things and maybe allow people to go more mobile in the future as well with AR, because it will be able to be much more frugal with the use of the GPU when it only needs to render the central part of your vision in high resolution. The rest, obviously, is down-res and the LOD changes and things like this. As far as design, I mean, one of the things that we're aware of is that your natural field of view degrades at the periphery. So that when if you're looking at something, your peripheral vision is massively down-resed naturally, right? And the reason for that is because your peripheral vision, things start to become, and that is why, for example, driving down the highway, your eye can recognize a sign on the side, it glancing at it, because it understands the shape. It doesn't need detail. The detail is lost in your peripheral vision anyway. And it's actually black and white, believe it or not. Your peripheral vision is actually black and white as well. What that means is that foveated rendering is a natural fit for the way your eyes work in a natural way. So I think that from a design perspective, what that means is that you need to have dynamic interfaces which go from a highly detailed object that's right in front of you, and then if I turn my head to the side, while it's down-resed, it also becomes more symbolic at the periphery. So, you may have things that need to have different levels of LOD all the time. So all of it is not hard-coded or hard-rendered, but it's simply procedural rendering.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, what about selective focus? What's your take on that? Because we don't see everything in the world clear, right? If I have something up close to me and I'm focusing on you, which you're behind that object, the object in front of you is going to be out of focus. How does that affect design in AR as well?
Same thing. It's just, now you're talking about a Z-plane level of degradation. And I think selective focus is going to be very important, like multifocal plane. That hasn't been cracked yet in a way that I think is useful or natural. I mean, Magic Leap has 2 focal planes, but due to the nature of the way that they do it, the kind of constraints of how they do it, it's a kind of hard cut between the 2 planes, which, of course, from the eye perspective, can sometimes feel unnatural because that's not how your eyes work. I mean, like you just said, we have, looking around the environment, your eyes naturally move in a very analog way between different objects. It moves in and out of focus. It's not hard cut. So I think that's a challenge optically. And then on the design perspective, it's the same thing. If I put an object far in front of you, you look at it, the problem is back to the pixels per degree. Because even if I've got a multifocal plane display, if the far plane is still, the object is small because it's far away, it isn't rendered accurately. It's because the actual resolution of the screen can't make it any higher resolution. So you're going to have a bunch of challenges there around this.
So from the industry perspective, you've got training, gaming, and enterprise apps. What's your take on the future? What do you think is really going to take off for AR? And the reason I ask is if you're designing for an enterprise app, it's going to be a little bit different, or actually quite a bit different, perhaps maybe not, than designing for gaming or even designing for training. So what do you feel is going to be really the future that designers should look into?
I think the business side, the enterprise side, is often a driver for adoption. I mean, if you think about the smartphone was a big success before the iPhone. I mean, coming from Europe, and Nokia that invented the smartphone, they were selling, 300 million smartphones a quarter at their peak. And a large proportion of that was to companies, because it was seen as something incredibly valuable, in terms of a tool. And, BlackBerry, exactly the same, before consumers really got hold of these phones with iOS and stuff later. So a similar path to adoption, we feel, with Meta. We're working a lot with companies and third-party partners on the business side, on the enterprise side, to build useful tools. And we feel that the kind of wedge in the door starts where people see value, not just gimmickry and fun, which is fine, but value, that it actually changes the way they work. And this is the idea that I mentioned, early in this conversation about having a profound change. So we think, the enterprise and designing solutions that provide new ways of looking at data and looking at things is the way that AR will show that it's different to, what we've had before, to the smartphone or to the laptop or whatever. I mean, we work with different companies. We work with SolidWorks, for example, and we understand a lot about three-dimensional modeling and the visualization and the importance of visualization for making decisions. If you're anyone working in creating real things, That could be from like designing shoes to industrial parts to designing houses. These are all natural three-dimensional objects in the real world. And so AR is a perfect fit for trying to accelerate working within that medium from the start. So my advice is to really look at that side, because there's a great interest in adopting this technology. The flip side, the challenge for designers and developers doing that is, of course, you need to be more rigorous, because time is money for these companies. And that means that they're less tolerant of, let's say, alpha level quality of how you do things. Whereas, of course, you know, if you're in the consumer AR land, yeah, you can release on the App Store, any kind of anything. And people are relatively tolerant if it's a gimmick or it's a little bit of fun. But of course, the workflow is important in businesses and enterprise and productivity. And so a lot of the focus has to be around, well, how does my idea slot in to how they do things? And that comes down to a lot of, you know, research that needs to be done.
I agree with you 100%. I think the enterprises where both VR and AR would really take off, just like desktop computing did in the 80s, right? It didn't really take off until computers were adopted by corporations. People in corporations said, oh, wow, I can do accounting here. Why can't I do accounting at home? And then it migrated to the house, right? And I think that part of the problem also with AR and VR, the adoption problem, you don't understand it until you try it. And right now, it's kind of not only expensive, but there's a lot of barriers to entry, right? Technology, like setting it up, hooking it up, running your app. Whereas if you try it at work, you'll try it, understand it, and boom, it'll come to the house.
Yeah, that's right. In companies, maybe the IT group has already set it up for you as a user. So all you really are getting is the benefits. I mean, that's a good analogy about, you know, the setup. I often think about VR, and I think about, you know, the early adopters of VR with Oculus and HTC. You know, they're okay with cables everywhere, and they're okay with spending, you know, the day getting everything ready and getting the environment ready and stuff, because they're incredibly enthusiastic and they'd love to tinker and try things. But of course, when you get down towards productization and you get down to productivity, that's no longer something that is attractive. That's a problem for adoption. And until we have much more seamless integration, you know, we're looking, for example, at collaboration, and we're trying to look to make something seamless, because again, you know, we're trying to make something that people can quickly get into the value proposition, rather than, you know, getting caught up in a cable salad, panicking and wondering, is this what the future looks like? So I think that part is really important to solve.
Kharis, I wish I had 10 more hours to talk to you, because, you know, I think we've touched upon only a couple of questions that I originally was going to ask you. This was a super fun conversation, but I do have one last question about mixed reality, because personally, I believe in the future, it's not going to be VR, it's not going to be AR, it's just going to be mixed reality, meaning that you can go in and out, and you're not even going to know when you're in real reality, when you're in AR, and when you're in VR. So how do designers today start preparing themselves for that future? Maybe it's 5 years from now, maybe it's 10 years from now, but that future where people won't know the difference between reality and AR and VR. It's all going to be one thing.
That's an interesting ending question. It's arguably the least understood part of anything involving AR, VR. And what I mean by that is really what you're talking about is a colossal amount of responsibility, because when you get into the situation where everything is interchangeable and photoreal and no one knows the difference, you are getting into a situation of essentially hallucination, that there is no reality anymore. Reality is entirely subjective, and that can be fun, that could be good, that can also be really terrifyingly bad, depending on what your responsibility or how responsible you are around what you create. One of the things that I did mention in my book was that, you know, when you get to that stage, you're going to have essentially a new form of potential illness. You know, we're used to hearing stories on the news of people who cannot differentiate between reality and non-reality, and they're high on drugs or whatever, and they get grabbed because they're chasing goblins down the street or whatever. The concern in the future is, what if in the future people are still chasing goblins or being chased by goblins that appear around corners down the street? And yet this is not drugs anymore. This is the technology level that we've got to. And I think, having the ability to alter one's reality, which is really what we're talking about here, is a tremendous responsibility. And I think that the challenges of the future will be ethical. They potentially will be moderated because of the impact that it may have on vulnerable individuals. I've seen it myself. I've seen it with my own children. I've seen them chase things, holograms, and run into walls with the headset on, which was very awkward, and I got told off for doing that. But nonetheless, you can already see the impact of that approach. It was actually, I think, just, to quote Roni from Magic Leap, they were working on something, and, they made something that looked very photoreal, and they actually had to downgrade it. He actually mentioned in an interview last year, because of that, suddenly you're aware, oh no, people think this is actually real. And the problem with that is that you treat it as if it's real, and that can have all kinds of profound, sociological issues in a world where we see things that are not there, but also from kind of psychological issues that come up with that. My personal take is I'm excited for this. I think that this is a brave new world we're going into. We just need to go into it kind of eyes wide open and be aware of the responsibilities and not be afraid to deal with those head on, not brush them under the carpet and say that's someone else's problem, but actually, okay, we are building technologies that will fundamentally alter the way we see the world. I'm excited though. We're excited at Meta.
I'm 100% with you. I'm totally excited about the future possibilities. And like any new technology, obviously, you can use it both for good and for bad. And putting a framework in place, this is my simplified view on this, but putting a framework in place that allows for making sure that you don't use it for bad is going to be the answer. But we can't stop what's happening, because I believe this is happening and it will happen maybe within the next 10, 15 years. But I think there's going to come a point where maybe my kids' won't know the difference between reality and not reality. Of course, you can ask the question, is that good? Is that bad? Who knows? We as humans always create our own reality, right? What we think is real, and all the rules that we put in place that we just made up. So
yeah, we could definitely go down the rabbit hole just on that alone. But I do think you're right that I'm going to say within 10 years, we will be in that place. I mean, I see a lot of technology behind the scenes, and it shocks me. Even though I'm behind the curtain, I'm still shocked at how fast we are able to move. And I see some of these technologies coming through, and I realize that, yes, it will be my children's generation that will be the first really impacted by this new world. And so there's a mix of excitement and, nervous energy around this.
It's an awesome time to be alive.
Yes, it is.
Definitely. All right, Kharis, seriously, I wish I had a couple more hours and maybe grab a beer with you to continue our conversation, but unfortunately, we can't. But thank you so much. If they just want to learn more about Meta, where do they go?
www.metavision.com.
Kharis, seriously, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think this is the longest interview I've had so far, so you broke my records.
Wow, and we've only just touched the surface.
Right? Exactly. I think I have 25 more questions I didn't get to, so that's okay. We'll leave it for part 2.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2 at some point.
All right, Kharis, thank you so much. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you'd like to watch video interviews and how-to tutorials all about VR and AR, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at howtocreatevr.com/YouTube. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR and AR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. And finally, if you're interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.